On the morning of June 13, 1944, the quiet town of Villers-Bocage in Normandy became the stage for one of the most devastating tank actions of World War II. Just days after the D-Day landings, British forces believed they had found a weakness in the German defensive lines. The 7th Armored Division, known as the Desert Rats, pushed forward with their Cromwell and Challenger tanks through the Normandy-Bocage, that dense network of hedgerows and narrow lanes that made movement so difficult. They thought they could exploit a gap in the German positions and swing around the German flank near the town. What they did not know was that a young German tank commander named Michael Wittmann was watching their every move from a carefully concealed position in the woods above the town. Wittmann commanded a Tiger Ausf tank number 205, one of the most formidable weapons ever built for armored warfare. The British column stretched out along the road like a vulnerable line of vehicles moving through unfamiliar terrain. Intelligence reports had suggested that German armor in the area was limited and scattered, but this assessment proved dangerously incorrect. Wittmann had positioned his tank perfectly to observe the road while remaining completely hidden from British view. He waited patiently with his crew, knowing that the element of surprise would be his greatest advantage in the coming engagement. His gunner sat ready at the main gun, fingers poised near the firing mechanism, waiting for the command that would unleash terrible destruction upon the unsuspecting British convoy below. Michael Wittmann was born in 1914 in Vogelthal, Bavaria, and had become one of Germany's most celebrated and feared tank commanders by 1944. He had distinguished himself on the Eastern Front, where he fought against the Soviet Red Army and earned the Knight's Cross for his exceptional bravery and tactical skill in combat. Before receiving the Knight's Cross, he had already destroyed numerous enemy tanks and vehicles, building a reputation as a cool and calculating commander under fire. His Tiger tank was one of the most fearsome weapons in the entire German arsenal. Equipped with thick frontal armor that could withstand repeated hits from most Allied anti-tank weapons. The 88mm gun mounted on the Tiger was legendary for its accuracy and devastating power, capable of penetrating the armor of any Allied tank at considerable range. Wittmann understood the fundamental principles of armored warfare and knew that terrain, positioning, and timing were just as important as the capabilities of the machine he commanded. He had studied the tactics of successful commanders and applied these lessons throughout his career in mechanized combat. His experience fighting in Russia against the Soviets had taught him how to survive in the most intense and brutal tank engagements. Wittmann's crew members were veteran tankers who had trained with him extensively and understood his commands without excessive explanation. They trusted him completely and knew that following his orders gave them the best chance of survival in the deadly game of tank warfare. His reputation for coolness under fire was well known throughout the German Wehrmacht, and younger tank commanders looked up to him as an example of professionalism and tactical excellence. The British column moving toward Villers-Bocage consisted primarily of light and medium tanks that were not well suited for engaging heavy German armor in direct combat. The Cromwell tanks were fast and relatively maneuverable, but carried only a 75mm gun that lacked the penetrating power needed to reliably defeat a Tiger at distance. The Challenger tanks mounted a 17-pounder gun, which was more powerful, but the vehicles themselves were still vulnerable to the Tiger's superior firepower and armor protection. The column was strung out in single file along the narrow roads of Normandy, bunched closely together with little space to maneuver or deploy to defensive formations. British commanders had become somewhat overconfident after the initial success of the D-Day landings and the capture of various Norman towns. They believed that German armored forces had been largely defeated or pushed back far from this area of operations. The trucks and support vehicles interspersed among the combat tanks made the column even more vulnerable and restricted its ability to fight effectively if attacked. Tank crews were fatigued after days of continuous operations and movement through the Normandy countryside. Drivers were concentrating on navigating the difficult terrain rather than maintaining full alertness for enemy threats. The lead vehicles of the column had just entered Villers-Bocage itself when Wittmann made his decision to attack. The element of complete surprise was on his side, and he knew this advantage would only last for a precious few moments before the British could react and organize any kind of defense. Wittmann gave the signal, and his Tiger tank burst from the concealment of the woods and trees above the British column with dramatic suddenness and force. In those first crucial seconds, the Germans had complete tactical surprise over the British forces spread out before them. The British crews in their tanks had absolutely no time to react properly or establish any kind of organized defense against this sudden onslaught from a completely unexpected direction and location. Wittmann's gunner quickly aimed the main gun, and the cannon roared, sending armor-piercing shells downrange at tremendous velocity and power. The first British tank in the column was hit by a direct strike and erupted into flames as the shell penetrated its armor and ignited ammunition stored inside. Another tank was struck seconds later and added its flames to the growing inferno that now consumed part of the British convoy. One after another, British tanks were struck by the devastating Tiger cannon fire as Wittmann methodically worked his way down the length of the column. German gunners operating anti-tank guns positioned nearby added their fire to the ambush, but Wittmann's Tiger was doing most of the damage. The noise and smoke and flames created absolute chaos and confusion among the British forces. Drivers were trying desperately to maneuver their vehicles to escape the killing zone, but many found themselves trapped in the narrow streets. Tank commanders were shouting desperate orders over the radio, trying to organize some kind of response, but their voices could barely be heard over the roar of exploding shells and burning vehicles. The British soldiers and tankers were experiencing the terrifying sensation of being attacked from an unknown position by an unseen enemy with tremendous firepower. Within the space of just 15 minutes, Wittmann's Tiger had knocked out or destroyed 14 British tanks and armored vehicles in one of the most spectacular ambush attacks of the entire Normandy campaign. This extraordinary and remarkable feat of arms made Villers-Bocage forever famous in the annals of tank warfare history and military strategy. British crews died horrible deaths in those burning vehicles engulfed in flames, while many more of their comrades were wounded and traumatized by this devastating experience of combat. The entire column was thrown into complete and utter disarray as surviving tank commanders tried desperately to reorganize their forces and regroup with other British units in the area. Some tanks managed to back away and find protective cover behind buildings and thick hedgerows, returning fire when they could, but unable to effectively damage the German Tiger tank at range due to the gun power limitations. Wittmann's Tiger had suffered no significant damage during the entire engagement and remained fully operational and combat capable. The gun crews operating the supporting German anti-tank weapons had also performed admirably and contributed significantly to the destruction of the British column. However, it was really Wittmann's Tiger tank and his exceptional skill as a commander and gunner that had inflicted most of the tremendous damage on the column. The British forces realized they were facing a superior opponent in direct combat and made the difficult decision to withdraw and reorganize rather than risk further losses in a direct assault. What made this devastating action even more remarkable and impressive was that Wittmann accomplished this extraordinary ambush attack with support from only a few other German tank destroyers and anti-tank guns that were positioned strategically in the surrounding area. The German forces were badly outnumbered overall in Normandy, but had achieved local numerical superiority at this critical point and place. A Panzer IV tank and some German anti-tank guns positioned nearby added their firepower to the initial and follow-up assaults on the British column. But it was really Wittmann's Tiger tank, his exceptional skill as a commander, and his gunner's accuracy that did most of the devastating damage to the British vehicles and personnel. Wittmann's reputation for coolness under fire and tactical awareness allowed him to make rapid split-second decisions that kept his own tank alive and operational. He knew when to move his position to avoid return fire and when to concentrate firepower on particularly dangerous threats. His crew responded instantly to his commands and worked together with the precision of a well-oiled machine during combat. The Tiger tank's superior armor protection saved the vehicle from being disabled by the sporadic and somewhat ineffective return fire from the British tanks. Wittmann's understanding of the terrain and the capabilities of his own vehicle and those of his opponents gave him a decisive advantage in this engagement. The British forces immediately attempted to counterattack and regain the strategic initiative, but quickly found themselves outgunned and thoroughly outmaneuvered by the superior German armor and firepower. They tried to bring anti-tank guns into position, but the deployment was hastily organized and ineffective against the well-positioned Tiger tank. Wittmann withdrew his Tiger carefully before British reinforcements could arrive in sufficient numbers to surround him and create an inescapable trap. He understood the limits of his tactical advantage and knew that staying in one place too long would eventually result in overwhelming British forces surrounding and destroying him. The German commander made the prudent decision to withdraw to prepared defensive positions where he could fight under more favorable circumstances. He had inflicted such a heavy toll on the British forces that they were forced to completely abandon their attempts to push rapidly through Villers-Bocage and reorganize their entire offensive strategy in the area. The British command structure was shocked by the ferocity of the German resistance and the effectiveness of the ambush. German armor had proven once again that it remained a formidable opponent despite the overall superiority of British numbers and resources. The Villers-Bocage ambush sent shockwaves through the British command structure and reminded everyone in the Allied forces that German tanks and German tankers remained extremely dangerous enemies. News of the Villers-Bocage ambush spread quickly and efficiently through the German command structure and the wider German population back home. Wittmann became an even greater hero in the eyes of the German public and military establishment than he had been before. He had demonstrated the tremendous power and prowess of the Tiger tank in a dramatic and unmistakable fashion that could not be ignored or downplayed. Wittmann had proven once again that individual courage and exceptional skill could still matter decisively in modern mechanized and armored warfare. German propaganda organizations made extensive use of this victory and used it to boost morale among the German population and armed forces. Stories of Wittmann's exploits were broadcast on German radio and published in newspapers to demonstrate that German forces were still capable of achieving victories against the seemingly unstoppable Allies. The morale boost was particularly important at a time when German forces were being pushed back on multiple fronts across Europe, and the eventual outcome of the war was becoming increasingly uncertain. Wittmann received additional recognition and decorations from German military authorities for his outstanding performance at Villers-Bocage. His fame as a tank commander spread throughout occupied France and into Germany itself. Young German tank crews studied the battle and tried to apply the lessons to their own tactical doctrines and training procedures. However, the strategic reality of this situation was far less optimistic and encouraging than the spectacular tactical victory at Villers-Bocage might have suggested to observers. The Germans could not replace the tanks and men that were being lost and killed in Normandy at any reasonable rate, while the British and Americans could call upon seemingly unlimited supplies and fresh reinforcements from across the Atlantic Ocean. Wittmann had won a brilliant and impressive battle, but he could not win the war through tactical victories alone. The fundamental problem facing German forces was one of arithmetic and industrial capacity rather than tactical skill or individual bravery. The Nazis knew they were fighting against superior numbers and industrial might that would eventually overwhelm them, no matter how skilled their individual tank commanders might be. The German military leadership understood that the war would ultimately be decided by industrial production and the availability of manpower rather than by individual tactical successes. Wittmann's victory at Villers-Bocage was a bright spot in an otherwise darkening strategic picture for German forces in Normandy and France. The Americans and British would continue pouring men and material into France at an accelerating rate as the summer of 1944 progressed. Wittmann continued to fight actively in his Tiger tank number 205 through the summer of 1944 as the Normandy campaign progressed and the situation deteriorated for German forces. He was involved in numerous additional engagements and fierce tank battles around the town of Caen and other strategic locations in Normandy, where German armor tried desperately and repeatedly to contain the expanding Allied lodgment on French soil. His Tiger tank became a familiar sight to both German and Allied forces in the area, and his reputation grew with each successful engagement. Wittmann remained largely undefeated in direct tank-to-tank combat during this period, though he suffered minor wounds and his tank was damaged repeatedly and then repaired. The overall German situation in Normandy continued to deteriorate as more and more Allied forces poured across the English Channel and established themselves firmly on French soil. German forces were being pushed back slowly, but inexorably by the combined weight of British, Canadian, and American armor and infantry. Wittmann knew the situation was becoming increasingly desperate, but he continued to fight with the same dedication and skill that had made him famous throughout Germany. He organized the defense of his sector and coordinated with nearby German units to maximize their limited firepower. His leadership and tactical ability helped to slow the Allied advance, even though the outcome was becoming increasingly clear to military observers. The month of August 1944 brought a major and catastrophic crisis for the German forces in Normandy, with the development of the Villers-Bocage and the encirclement of a large German force. Wittmann and his Tiger tank were caught up directly in the desperate and intense fighting as German forces tried desperately to escape the tightening encirclement and avoid being trapped and destroyed. The Villers-Bocage represented the last major attempt by German forces to contain the expanding Allied presence in Normandy, and the failure to close the pocket represented a catastrophic defeat. Wittmann was commanding from the turret of his Tiger tank during this period of absolutely intense combat and constant danger to life and limb. He could see with clear eyes that the German situation was becoming increasingly hopeless, and that defeat in Normandy was now inevitable. However, he continued to fight with the same dedication and skill that had characterized his entire military career and made him famous. Wittmann worked to extract his unit from the Villers-Bocage and preserve his men for continued operations elsewhere. He coordinated with other German commanders to establish defensive positions and slow the Allied advance. The chaos and confusion of the retreat tested even his considerable tactical abilities and command skills. On August 8, 1944, near the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramasnil in the Falaise area, Wittmann encountered a group of Canadian tanks from the 1st Polish Armored Division in a fierce and intense engagement. The fighting around the Villers-Bocage was particularly vicious and brutal, with German forces making desperate and often futile attempts to break through Allied encirclement and escape to the east. Wittmann's Tiger engaged the Polish and Canadian forces in what would ultimately prove to be his final and fatal battle of World War II. The exact circumstances of his death and the destruction of his Tiger tank remain somewhat unclear and have been debated vigorously by historians for many decades. Some accounts suggest his tank was hit by an anti-tank gun or possibly by fire from a British Sherman tank that had been positioned carefully to ambush the German vehicle. The Tiger was reportedly severely damaged in the engagement, and Wittmann ordered his surviving crew members to bail out and abandon the vehicle before it exploded completely. As the crew scrambled desperately to escape the burning Tiger tank, Wittmann was struck by machine gun fire and killed instantly before he could reach safety and the protection of nearby hedgerows. He was only 30 years old at the time of his death. Another version of events, and Wittmann's death suggests that Canadian forces may have been responsible for destroying his Tiger tank in a different location than the village of St. Aignan-de-Crumsnil previously mentioned. The confusion surrounding his death and the exact location of his final engagement reflects the chaotic and confused nature of the fighting in and around the Falaise pocket during those final desperate days of August 1944. German forces were being compressed relentlessly into an ever smaller and smaller area, while Allied forces closed in from all directions with overwhelming firepower and manpower. In the absolute chaos of retreat and pursuit, with shells exploding and smoke obscuring visibility, it was easy for individual actions and events to become confused and misremembered in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Survivors often had conflicting memories of exactly what happened and where specific events occurred. German records were often lost or incomplete due to the confusion of retreat. Allied records sometimes conflicted with each other regarding which units engaged which German vehicles. The passage of decades has made definitive determination of the exact circumstances increasingly difficult for historians. Regardless of the exact circumstances of his death and the final moments of his life, Michael Wittmann's legacy as one of Germany's greatest and most celebrated tank commanders remain absolutely secure and unquestioned. His actions at Villers-Bocage had demonstrated conclusively the tremendous power and capability of the Tiger tank in the hands of a skilled and experienced commander. Wittmann had proven that superior tactics and positioning could overcome numerical disadvantage in specific tactical situations. The ambush had destroyed 14 British tanks in just 15 minutes and had temporarily disrupted the British offensive plans in Normandy for several hours. This magnificent feat of arms made Villers-Bocage one of the most famous and studied tank battles of World War II. Military historians, armor enthusiasts, and students of tactical warfare continue to analyze and study this engagement more than 80 years after it occurred. Wittmann's combat record and tactical achievements are carefully examined in military academies and war colleges around the world as examples of exceptional leadership under fire. The battle demonstrated the importance of terrain, positioning, surprise, and tactical discipline in armored combat. Commanders study how Wittmann used concealment and the element of surprise to overcome numerical disadvantage. The Tiger tank itself became legendary and almost mythical in the eyes of both German and Allied forces throughout Europe and beyond. Its thick armor protection and powerful 88mm gun made it a genuinely formidable and terrifying opponent that had to be respected and approached with considerable caution and proper planning. However, the Tiger's spectacular success at places like Villers-Bocage could not overcome the fundamental and ultimately insurmountable problem facing German forces in 1944 and beyond. The Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and personnel that was absolutely impossible for Germany to match or overcome. The Allies also possessed the ability to replace their losses with new vehicles and trained crews, while Germany had neither the industrial capacity nor the manpower to replace equivalent losses. For every Tiger tank destroyed, the Germans could build only a few replacements, while the Americans and British could produce dozens of replacement tanks. The strategic situation made German victory in Normandy impossible regardless of how many individual tactical victories they might achieve. German commanders understood this grim arithmetic, but continued to fight anyway, hoping for some kind of political settlement or change in circumstances that might alter the overall equation. Villers-Bocage represented both the absolute peak and pinnacle of German armored achievement in Normandy, and simultaneously the beginning of the end for German hopes of containing the Allies in France and reversing the course of the war. Wittmann had achieved a stunning and impressive tactical victory on June 13th, but it had no real strategic impact on the overall course of the campaign or the war. The British reorganized their forces after suffering the loss of 14 tanks, brought up reinforcements and additional armor, and continued their advance into Normandy with characteristic determination. Within weeks following the ambush, the German forces in Normandy had been shattered and defeated, with the survivors in full and disorganized retreat toward the Rhine River and German territory. The dream of containing the Allies in Normandy and pushing them back into the sea had become completely and utterly impossible after the Villers-Bocage and the breakthrough to Paris. Wittmann's personal achievements could not alter these massive historical forces and fundamental strategic realities. The Villers-Bocage ambush remained an impressive tactical achievement, but nothing more in the context of the Greater War. The story of Michael Wittmann and the Villers-Bocage ambush represents a crucial and pivotal moment in the entire history of armored warfare and modern combat. It showed definitively that individual skill, experience, and bravery could still achieve remarkable and extraordinary results, even in an age of mechanized mass combat with overwhelming firepower. However, it also demonstrated that tactical victories, however stunning and impressive they might appear, could not reverse the tide of history when superior resources and manpower were arrayed against a nation fighting desperately for survival against overwhelming odds. Wittmann had become a legend in his own time and remains one to this very day, but his personal legend could not save Germany from defeat or alter the course of World War II. The ambush at Villers-Bocage remains a testament to the fighting spirit and skill of German tank crews during the desperate final years of the Nazi regime. Today, the memory of Michael Wittmann endures as a reminder of the importance of tactical skill and leadership in warfare, and the ambush continues to be studied by military professionals and historians around the globe as an example of armored combat in its most intense and dramatic form during the final stages of the Second World War in Europe.